हेलो दोस्तों, बिगनर्स पॉइंट में आपका स्वागत है। और अभी हम कर रहे हैं इकोनॉमिक्स का चैप्टर 2 और ये है क्लास 12th का चैप्टर 2। ठीक है। थ्योरी ऑफ कंज्यूमर बिहेवियर। इन दिस चैप्टर वी विल स्टडी द बिहेवियर ऑफ एन इंडिविजुअल कंज्यूमर। इंडिविजुअल यानी कि अलग अलग तरीके से। ठीक है। एक कंज्यूमर ये है, एक कंज्यूमर ये है, एक कंज्यूमर ये है, एक ये है, एक ये है और एक ये है। 6 कंज्यूमर हैं, अलग अलग के बिहेवियर के बारे में, कैसे वो बिहेव करते हैं, सामान खरीदने में क्या उनका बिहेवियर होता है। द कंज्यूमर हैज़ टू डिसाइड हाउ टू स्पेंड हर इनकम ऑन डिफरेंट गुड्स। इकोनॉमिस्ट call this the problem of choice. Most naturally, any consumer will want to get a combination of goods that gives her maximum satisfaction. What will be this best combination? This depends on the likes of the consumer and what the consumer can afford to buy. The likes of the consumer are also called preferences, and what the consumer can afford to buy depends on prices of the goods and the income of the consumer. This chapter presents two different approaches that explain consumer behavior: cardinal utility analysis and ordinal utility analysis. Primary notations and assumptions. A consumer in general consumes many goods, but for simplicity, we shall consider the consumer's choice problem in a situation where there are only two goods, bananas and mangoes. Any combination of the amount of the two goods will be called a consumption bundle, or in short, a bundle. In general, we shall use the variable x1 to denote the quantity of bananas and x2 to denote the quantity of mangoes. x1, x2 can be positive or 0. x1, x2 would mean the bundle consisting of x1 quantity of bananas and x2 quantity of mangoes. For particular values of x1 and x2, x1, x2 would give us a particular bundle. For example, the bundle 510 consists of 5 bananas and 10 mangoes. The bundle 10-5 consists of 10 bananas and 5 mangoes. अब आ जाते हैं यूटिलिटी। अ कंज्यूमर यूजुअली डिसाइड्स हिज डिमांड फॉर अ कमोडिटी ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ यूटिलिटी और satisfaction that he derives from it. What is utility? Utility of a commodity is its want satisfying capacity. The more the need of a commodity, or the stronger the desire to have it, the greater is the utility derived from the commodity. Utility is subjective. Different individuals can get different levels of utility from the same commodity. For example, someone who likes chocolates will get much higher utility from a chocolate than someone who is not so fond of chocolates. Also, utility that one individual gets from the commodity can change with change in place and time. For example, utility from the use of a room heater will depend upon whether the individual is in Ladakh or Chennai place, or whether it is summer or winter time. Cardinal utility analysis. Cardinal utility analysis assumes that level of utility can be expressed in numbers. For example, we can measure the utility derived from a shirt and say this shirt gives me 50 units of utility. Before discussing further, it will be useful to have a look at two important measures of utility. Measures of utility: total utility of fixed quantity of a commodity. TU is the total satisfaction derived from consuming the given amount of some commodity X. More of commodity X provides more satisfaction to the consumer. TU depends on the quantity of the commodity consumed. Therefore, TUN refer to the total utility derived from consuming n units of a commodity X. Marginal utility mu is the change in total utility due to consumption of one additional unit of a commodity. For example, suppose 4 bananas give us 28 units of total utility and 5 bananas give us 30 units of total utility. Clearly, consumption of the fifth banana has caused total utility to increase by 2 units. 30 units minus 28 units. Therefore, marginal utility of the 5 banana is 2 units. In general, mu TUN minus 1, where subscript n refers to the nth unit of the commodity. Total utility and marginal utility can also be related in following way. TUN is equal to mu1 plus mu2 plus mu minus 1 plus mun. This simply means that TU derived from consuming n units of banana is the sum total of marginal utility of first banana mu1, marginal utility of second banana mu2, and so on till the marginal utility of the nth unit. Table 2.1 and figure 2.1 show an imaginary explain of the values of marginal and total utility derived from the consumption of various amounts of a commodity. Usually, it is seen that the marginal utility diminishes with increase in consumption of the commodity. This happens because having obtained some amount of the commodity, the desire of the consumer to have still more of it becomes weaker. The same is also shown in the table graph. Units टोटल यूटिलिटी और मार्जिनल यूटिलिटी एक का 12 फिर मार्जिनल 12 टोटल यूटिलिटी 18 और मार्जिनल 6 3 टोटल यूटिलिटी 22 और मार्जिनल 4 4 24 और 2 5 24 और 0 6 22 और माइनस। Notice that mu3 is less than mu2. You may also notice that total utility increases but at a diminishing rate. The rate of change in total utility due to change in quantity of commodity consumed is a measure of marginal utility. This marginal utility diminishes with increase in consumption of the commodity from 12 to 6, 6 to 4, and so on. This follows from the law of diminishing marginal utility. Law of diminishing marginal utility states that marginal utility from consuming each additional unit of a commodity declines as its consumption increases, while keeping consumption of other commodities constant. Mu becomes zero at a level when Tu remains constant. In the example, Tu does not change at fifth unit of consumption and therefore Mu5 equals to 0. Thereafter, Tu starts falling and Mu becomes negative. Derivation of demand curve. In the case of a single commodity, law of diminishing marginal utility. Cardinal utility analysis can be used to derive demand curve for a commodity. What is demand and what is demand curve? The quantity of a commodity that a consumer is willing to buy and is able to afford given prices of goods and income of the consumer is called demand for that commodity. Demand for a commodity X, apart from the price of X itself, demands on factors such as prices of other commodities, such substitutes and complements. 2.4.4 Income of the consumer and taste and preferences of the consumers. Demand curve is a graphic presentation of various quantities of a commodity that a consumer is willing to buy at different prices of the same commodity while holding constant price of other related commodities and income of the consumer. Figure 2.2 presents hypothetical demand curve of an individual for commodity X at its different prices. Quantity is measured along the horizontal axis and price is measured along the vertical prices. The downward sloping demand curve shows that at lower prices, the individual is willing to buy more of commodity X. At higher prices, she is willing to buy less of commodity X. Therefore, there is a negative relationship between price of commodity and quantity demanded, which is referred to as the law of demand. An explanation for a downward sloping demand curve rests of the notion of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that each successive unit of a commodity provides lower marginal utility. Therefore, the individual will not be willing to pay as much for each additional unit, and this results in a downward sloping demand curve. At a price of rupees 40 per unit X, individual's demand for X was 5 units. The sixth unit of commodity X will be worth less than 5 units. The individual will be willing to buy the sixth unit only when the price drops below 40 per unit. Hence, the law of diminishing marginal utility explains why, why demand curves have a negative slope. Ordinal utility analysis. Cardinal utility analysis is simple to understand but suffers from a major drawback in the form of quantification of utility in numbers. In real life, we never express utility in the form of numbers. At the most, we can rank various alternative combinations in terms of having more or less utility. In other words, the consumer does not measure utility in numbers, though she often ranks various consumption bundles. This forms the starting point of this topic or ordinal utility analysis. A consumer's preferences over the set of available bundles can often be represented diagrammatically. ये diagram हो गया bananas नीचे slope हो रहे हैं गिर रहे हैं. We have already seen that the bundles of the available to the consumer can be plotted as points in a two-dimensional diagram. The points representing bundles which give the consumer equal utility can generally be joined to obtain a curve like the one in figure 2.3. The consumer is said to be indifferent on the different bundles because each point of the bundles give the consumer equal utility. Such a curve joining all points representing bundles among which the consumer is indifferent is called indifference curve. All the points, such as A, B, C, D, lying on an indifference curve provide the consumer with the same level of satisfaction. It is clear that when a consumer gets one more banana, he has to forego some mangoes so that her total utility level remains the same and she remains on the same indifference curve. Therefore, indifference curve slopes downward. The amount of mangoes that the consumer has to forego in order to get an additional banana, her total utility level being the same, is called marginal rate of substitution (MRS). In other words, MRS is simply the rate at which the consumer will substitute bananas for mangoes so that her total utility remains constant. MRS is equal to delta y divided by delta 3 का cube. One can notice that in the table 2.2, as we increase the quantity of bananas, the quantity of mangoes sacrificed for each additional banana declines. In other words, MRS diminishes with increase in the number of bananas as the number of bananas with the consumer increase. The amount derived from each additional banana falls. Similarly, with the fall in quantity of mangoes, the marginal utility derived from mangoes increases. So, with increase in the number of bananas, the consumer will feel the inclination to sacrifice smaller and smaller amounts of mangoes. This tendency for the MRS to fall with increase in quantity of bananas is known as law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. This can be seen from figure 2.3 also. Going from point A to point B, the consumer sacrifice 3 mangoes for 1 banana. Going from point B to point C, the consumer sacrificed 2 mangoes for 1 banana. And going from point C to point D, the consumer sacrificed just 1 mango for 1 banana. Thus, it is clear that the consumer sacrificed smaller and smaller quantities of mangoes for each additional bananas. Shape of an indifference curve. It may be mentioned that the law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution causes an indifference curve to be convex to the origin. This is the most common shape of an indifference curve, but in case of goods being perfect substitutes, the marginal rate of substitution does not diminish. It remains the same. Let's take an example. Representation of law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Combination quantity of 5 rupees coins और MRS. बी का हो जाएगा 2, कॉइन्स का 7, MRS 1:1, सी 3 6 1:1, 4 5 1:1. Here the consumer is indifferent for all these combinations as long as the total of 5 rupees coins and 5 rupees notes remains the same. For the consumer, it hardly matters whether she gets a 5 rupee coin or a 5 rupee note. So, irrespective of how many 5 rupee notes she has, the consumer will sacrifice only one 5 rupee coin for a 5 rupee note. So, these two commodities are perfect substitutes for the consumer and indifference curve. Depicting these will be a straight line. In the figure 2.4, it can we seen that consumer sacrifice the same number of 5 rupee coins each time he has an additional 5 rupee note. अभी ये करेंगे इसके आगे कल यहाँ से।